Rescuers rushed toward the scene, believing there was still time. As they rushed through the streets, they could not yet see how bad it was. Only the growing crowd and the dust hanging in the air ahead of them. When they arrived, debris covered the ground, and they began digging through brick, iron, and broken beams, listening for voices beneath the wreckage. Hands reached through narrow gaps, and some bodies were pulled partway free. For a moment, rescue still seemed possible. Then, without warning, fire exploded out of the debris. Flames tore through cotton and shattered timbers with sudden force, spreading faster than anyone could react. The heat drove rescuers back, cutting off access to the wreckage and ending any chance of reaching those still trapped beneath it. This is the crime scene. But here's what makes this different from most industrial disasters. This wasn't an accident. This was a crime. The evidence was everywhere, documented, visible, reported. Multiple people knew. Multiple people made decisions. Multiple people walked away. The question isn't what happened. The question is, who's guilty? To answer that, we need to go back to where it started. A city built from the ground up for commerce. Lawrence, Massachusetts wasn't a town that grew organically over generations. It was designed in 1845 by investors who looked at the Merrimack River, saw water power, and decided to build an entire city from scratch for one purpose: manufacturing. The Essex Corporation was the main company that built the city and controlled development. They operated their own foundry, the Lawrence Machine Shop, which cast the iron pillars that held up the massive textile factories. Dozens of mills stood because of their process. When you wanted to build in Lawrence, you worked with Essex Corp, and they maintained standards. The rules held unless you had the power to rewrite them. John A. Lowell and J. Pickering Putnam did. They wanted to build a textile mill, and they negotiated something different. Charles Roro, head of Essex Corporation, agreed to let them bypass the usual process. Any construction crews they wanted, any foundry they wanted, any materials they wanted. Why would Essex Corp allow this? Keep that in mind. Lowell and Putnam hired Charles H. Bigelow, a West Point-trained engineer who served as chief engineer for Essex Corp, to design the Pemberton Mill. Bigelow was overseeing construction of multiple mills at the same time. Naturally, he was stretched thin. That pressure shows up on record. Letters found at the Lawrence History Center show Lowell and Putnam telling Bigelow, "Get his ass in gear, get the building built. We can't make money until this building is built." They wanted it done fast and cheap. So instead of using the Lawrence Machine Shop foundry that Essex Corp ordinarily required, they went with a place called the Eagle Foundry. Money was the advantage. Eagle Foundry underbid the competition. How did they do that? They had a practice. It had a name in the trade. The skim. Here's how it worked. You wanted uniform thickness from top to bottom, maybe 12 to 14 inches of solid iron all the way through. But the foundry could make the ends proper thickness while thinning out the middle. Thick ends, a thinner middle. From the outside, the pillar looked right. On the inside, it was something else. Eagle Foundry finished the pillars and asked for someone to come inspect them before delivery. Nobody came. They shipped them anyway. Construction continued. The Pemberton Mill was completed in 1853 at a cost of $850,000, a fortune for those times. A 5-story building, 280 feet long and 84 feet wide, filled with machinery designed to turn raw cotton into finished fabric. For 4 years under Lowell and Putnam's ownership, the mill operated. Then came the financial panic of 1857, and they sold. Got out. Sold the building at auction for $325,000. Taking a $350,000 loss, did they know something? Two buyers emerged. George Howe and David Nevins Sr., a giant mill in the heart of a manufacturing town. At a discount of 62%, how could anyone say no? This was their opportunity to make a name for themselves. As soon as they got the keys, they got to work fast. They wanted more production, more profit, so they jammed more machinery into the factory, more looms on upper floors, more weight pressing down on those pillars, more vibration shaking the structure every hour machines ran. Day after day, hundreds of workers filed through its doors. Under their ownership, business boomed, earning $1,500,000 per year. Most workers were young women and girls. Many were teenagers. Some were as young as 10 to 12 years old, standing at machines for hours on end. Irish immigrants who'd come to America seeking opportunity, fleeing famine and poverty back home, arriving in Lawrence with nothing and taking whatever jobs they could find. Long hours at low pay, surrounded by dangerous machinery with little safety protection. A 10-year-old standing at a machine for long shifts wasn't considered a tragedy in 1860. It was normal. For 7 years, life went on inside that building. Building Inspector George Howe had walked these floors many times before. On a cold, snowy Tuesday in January, he was making his usual rounds just before the end of the day. On one of the upper floors, he noticed something was wrong. The columns weren't straight anymore. They were leaning. Beams were sagging under their own weight. His stomach dropped and cold rushed through his chest. The floor beneath his feet felt different, like it was sinking. Howe didn't stop to investigate. He turned and ran. He made it out just ahead of the collapse. Outside, people watched the building begin to rock, almost. The walls bowed. The structure tilted, then gave way from back to front, folding in on itself in a matter of moments. Inside, there was no warning. One moment, workers were standing at their machines. The next, the floor vanished. Brick, iron, and machinery tore downward through the building. Metal shrieked, walls disintegrated, 5 stories collapsed in on themselves in about a minute. Workers on the upper floors fell 40 feet. Those below were crushed beneath everything above them. Then came silence, and then screaming. Dust filled the air so thick it was impossible to see. Hundreds were trapped under tons of wreckage, pinned in complete darkness with the weight of machinery pressing down on their bodies. People ran toward the site. Volunteers climbed into the ruins and began digging, working carefully as the wreckage shifted and settled with every movement. Some trapped workers could call out. Others were unconscious. Others were already dead. The cold set in as night fell. January temperatures dropped, but the work continued. Tools were brought, equipment dragged in. Hands reached through narrow gaps. Some bodies were pulled partway free. For hours, rescue seemed possible. Then, around 9:30 that night, flames appeared. Oil lamps and lanterns lit the work. Heating stoves had been running when the building fell. Somewhere in the wreckage, fire found cotton waste and oil-soaked wood. The ruins ignited. Rescuers now faced an impossible reality, where people they could hear were trapped beneath debris and couldn't be moved fast enough. Some were pulled partway out, but died before they could be freed. Witnesses heard cries from the wreckage. The fire spread too fast. The rescue turned into a recovery effort. How do you process that? Nobody in the country had ever seen something like this before. Rubble stayed for weeks. No crime scene tape, no barriers. Casual spectators walked through debris where people had burned alive hours earlier. The site literally became a tourist attraction. Europeans were coming to visit the site of this tragedy because no one had seen something like this before. While bodies were still being recovered, one reaction broke from the rest. Literally, the day after the building collapsed, John Lowell wrote letters to every major Boston newspaper. The message was simple and immediate. The Essex Company had built the mill under the supervision of an experienced engineer. That engineer was Charles Bigelow. The Boston Advertiser printed it on the front page. It came fast because it had to. Before investigators arrived, before testimony was taken, before responsibility could settle anywhere else. The story needed to be framed while the ruins were still smoking. George Howe and David Nevins followed the same instinct. Their defense was ready just as quickly. They hadn't built the mill, they said. They had only bought it. With the public story already forming, the legal process began. Hundreds were dead, and the public wanted answers. With so many dead and so many questions unanswered, the state could not remain silent. Under Massachusetts law, a coroner's inquest was convened to determine what had happened and who, if anyone, was responsible. It wasn't a courtroom trial in the modern sense, but it functioned like one. Witnesses were called, experts were brought in, testimony was taken under oath. Over days of hearings, a pattern began to emerge. Witness after witness described the same thing. Jesse Glover, who oversaw repairs, testified that he had always considered the building weak. Always. John Tuttle, responsible for brickwork, testified that he had complained to the architect Bigelow that he thought the walls were insufficient. Benjamin Coolidge, Bigelow's assistant during construction, admitted under oath, "I knew they were defective, but never had any fear of the mill collapsing." He knew from the start, and construction continued anyway. John Lay, a mechanical and civil engineer who had worked at the Lawrence machine shop, told the inquest, "I visited the ruins and seen 3 pillars, which are properly tested, should have been rejected. I should not willingly use such pillars myself. The wreckage backed them up." Investigators found cast iron columns riddled with defects, walls that had never been adequate for the load they carried, a structure that had been asked to support far more machinery than it was designed for. Cost-cutting during construction wasn't a footnote. It was central to why the building failed. And then something else came out. After the collapse, newspapers began publishing what many in Lawrence already knew. On January 14, 1860, the Architects and Mechanics Journal reported that when the mill was erected 7 years earlier, it had not been considered as strong as it ought to have been. Before any machinery was installed, the walls had spread so badly that iron plates were added simply to keep the building standing. 3 days later, the Eastern Argus went further. It reported that the building had never been considered staunch, that it was thought a sham from the beginning, that before machinery ever went in, the walls spread so much that 22 tons of iron stays were installed to keep the structure from collapsing under its own weight. Before machinery, before Howe and Nevins bought it, before the financial panic. From the moment construction finished in 1853, people knew. Scientific American put it bluntly. There was no doubt, they wrote, that the fall of the building was caused by gross negligence and a failure of integrity in casting the iron columns. The evidence was not subtle. The negligence was not hidden. And yet, when the inquest concluded, responsibility landed in a single place: Charles H. Bigelow, the engineer. He received what historians later described as singular blame for the disaster. The owners did not. According to Professor Robert Farran's research, the wealthy Bostonians who commissioned, financed, and profited from the mill walked away untouched in the cover-up that followed. There were no prosecutions, no jail time, no legal consequences. Bigelow died 2 years later, in 1862, at the age of 47. David Nevins Sr., meanwhile, rebuilt the mill within a year. It reopened for business. Insurance payouts, combined with his personal wealth, covered reconstruction costs estimated between $200,000 and $300,000. No insurance money went to the families of the dead. When Nevins died in 1881, his family erected the Nevins Memorial Library in his honor. One author praised the family's generosity, writing that their public spirit seemed to have no bounds. Which raises a question the inquest never answered. How do you build a library in your own honor after 145 people died in your building? That question lingers. But to make any sense of the whole thing, we need to step back. Let's review what we know. John A. Lowell and J. Pickering Putnam didn't build their mill under the normal system used in Lawrence. They negotiated an exception. Their own crews, their own foundry, their own materials. Charles Roro, head of the Essex Corporation, signed off. They chose Eagle Foundry. Eagle asked for an inspection before delivery. No one came. The work was substandard. During delivery, one of the pillars broke. Construction didn't stop. Warnings followed. An assistant engineer knew the pillars were defective. A supervisor complained the walls were insufficient. Different people, different moments. The same problem. 7 years passed. After the collapse, the original owners pointed to the engineer they hired in the newspapers. The current owners pointed back at the owners. When the inquest concluded, responsibility landed in one place. The engineer. He died 2 years later. The current owners rebuilt. Insurance paid. No compensation went to the families of the dead. No one went to jail. So where does responsibility belong? With Lowell and Putnam, who bypassed established standards to save money. With Eagle Foundry, which cut corners and shipped defective pillars anyway. With Charles Bigelow, who knew something was wrong, heard complaints about the walls, and kept working under pressure from men who controlled his career. With Howe and Nevins, who bought the building in 1857, overloaded it with machinery, saw the cracks, saw the iron stays holding it together, and kept running it? Or with the system itself? An America with no building codes, no safety inspections, no worker protections, a place where children working in dangerous factories was perfectly legal. The warnings weren't subtle. Defective pillars, walls spreading before machinery went in, iron stays added just to keep the building upright, cracks wide enough to see daylight. Between 88 and 145 people died. At least 166 were injured. The Pemberton Mill was built poorly from the beginning. It collapsed in 1 minute, and nobody went to jail. So, who do you think is at fault? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please like and subscribe.